Nations around the globe have had their best scientists pushing hard and fast to develop a COVID vaccine, and now they're beginning to be put into action. Is this the answer to the pandemic, or is it too soon and potentially a long-term health problem? Joining us from Upland, California is Dr. Fazale Rana, the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. He is a biochemist and is the author of Humans 2.0. Dr. Rana, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Rana, how much do we know about the new vaccines coming out now? First of all, do we know with any certainty how effective they'll be at preventing the spread of COVID-19?
Well, all indications are that these vaccines from Pfizer, BioNTech, as well as from Moderna are going to be highly effective. The phase 3 clinical studies indicated a 90% effectiveness rate. Just as a point of comparison, the annual flu vaccine that we receive is about 40 to 60% effective. So these are potentially highly effective vaccines.
That's very good news and should put a lot of people's minds at rest. So I understand that these particular vaccines are what is called a messenger RNA vaccine. So some people believe that this actually changes our DNA. Does it? Can you explain this?
Yeah, these vaccines are inherently safe, and so the vaccine is not going to change anybody's DNA. And the reason for that is because the key component, as you mentioned, is messenger RNA. And this molecule is not actually very stable. And so the researchers that developed these vaccines actually had to do some alterations to the structure of the molecule to make it more stable, just long enough to get to the cells. And they also had to encapsulate them in what's called a lipid nanoparticle to also afford protection. And then once the RNA is in the cell, it essentially is used by the cell's machinery to make the spike protein for the SARS-2 coronavirus, which is what elicits the immune response. But the RNA then is almost immediately broken down inside the cell, and it is never going to make its way into the cell nucleus where it could affect any kind of genetic change. So it's an inherently safe vaccine.
That's great to hear. So have mRNA vaccines ever been used on humans before this time?
No, this is a first. This is the first time, these RNA vaccines have ever been used in humans, but it doesn't mean that they're new. People have been working on the concept of RNA vaccines for several decades, and even as recently as 2018, researchers have actually done a number of animal studies looking at using these vaccines to protect against a number of different viral diseases. So it was really at the point where we were already about to transition these vaccines into human clinical studies that COVID-19 hit.
So, Dr. Rana, do we know the length of time COVID vaccines will provide protection for?
This is really the million-dollar question right now. Nobody really knows how long immunity will be afforded to people that have gotten COVID-19 or who have the vaccine. Initially, the concern was that immunity would not be very long lasting, but more recent studies actually are indicating that the immunity very well may last for months, maybe even years. And so this is actually really good news. And so it means that a worst case scenario would be people would have to get an annual booster. That's the worst case scenario. It may very well be people get vaccinated and they're good for several years.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, will these vaccines have to be updated every year, just like the influenza vaccines need to be?
Yeah, well, with the influenza virus, it undergoes quite radical mutations from year to year, which is why the vaccines need to be updated. It doesn't look like the SARS-2 coronavirus will undergo that level of mutational change over time. So it may be that in a few years, these vaccines may need to be updated, but I don't project that being the case, at least for the next few years.
Okay, so would someone who has been vaccinated still need to wear a mask and adhere to social distancing?
Yes, I think unfortunately that is going to be the case because remember, even though the vaccines appear to be effective at about a 90% rate, 10% of the people that get them can still acquire COVID-19 and can spread it to other people. And we don't really know necessarily who that's going to be. And so, bottom line is, in the short term, people will still have to wear masks, still have to practice social distancing not only to protect themselves, but really to protect other people who have yet to be vaccinated.
Yeah, for sure. So the concern many people have is that because the process has been too rushed, there's a potential health risk. At least one vaccine has had some side effects of Bell's palsy show up in some patients. So, how risky are the vaccines potentially? You were kind of alluding to the fact that you think they're pretty safe.
Yeah, well, we have to remember that these vaccines were given emergency approval simply because we're in the midst of a pandemic. And the regulators looked at the data and saw how effective the vaccines were and didn't see anything that really indicated that they would be unsafe on a large scale. With any kind of medical treatment, including vaccines, there's always potential for side effects. You never can really escape that. And so the biggest concern that I've seen is for people that are hyperallergenic, who respond to things by developing allergies really quickly. They might be susceptible to an allergic reaction to the vaccines. As you mentioned, there in both the Moderna and the Pfizer studies, 4 individuals developed Bell's palsy. It could be due to the vaccine, or it could just simply be happenstance. So that clearly isn't understood. And so I imagine we will see side effects emerging over time as these vaccines are used more broadly. But I think those side effects are only going to affect a relatively low number of individuals. So as a whole, I think these vaccines really are safe.
There's ongoing debate as to whether the COVID vaccine should be mandated for health workers and even for the public at large. Any thoughts on that? Is this ethical? Is it necessary?
Yeah, that the idea of mandating vaccines, I think, really doesn't sit well with most people because they see that as robbing them of their individual rights and their individual freedom. I probably anticipate seeing something that would be called an if-then mandate more so than a universal mandate, meaning that if you are, for example, a healthcare worker, or if you are a first responder, then you must get the vaccine. If you perhaps are a teacher or student, you must have the vaccine. We already require students to be vaccinated before they can go to public school. So I would see more like an if then mandate. And that way, you don't rob people of their individual freedom to choose to be vaccinated or not, but that you put in place common sense practices so that if people are going to travel or if they are assuming certain roles or positions in society, they must be vaccinated.
Right. There's also debate as to the ethics of who should receive the vaccine first. Should it be healthcare workers, the elderly, government employees, children? Any thoughts on how that should be handled?
Yeah, right now my biggest concern is with the equitable distribution of the vaccines. And Moderna thinks they can produce about 1 billion vaccines by the end of 2021. Pfizer and BioNTech think they can produce about the same number. So that's about 2 billion vaccines. There's 6 billion people or so in the world, which means not everybody's going to have access to the vaccines within the first couple of years. I project, unless we produce or sorry, develop more production capabilities. So that's going to be a real issue. And so when it comes to an individual country, an individual society, I think that the common sense approach makes sense, where again, you're making sure healthcare workers, first responders are vaccinated. I think you then move to the more vulnerable populations, which would obviously be elderly people. That makes sense. That's the way you're going to save the most lives. Also, of concern, at least in the United States, is that certain minority communities are much harder hit by COVID-19 than others. So the Latino and African American communities are hard hit. You could make a case that they should actually get moved to the front of the line to get the vaccines. So to me, I think it's really a common sense approach where the eye is towards protecting people, but also um, ensuring that we save the maximum number of lives.
There's some crazy conspiracy theories going around that there's an agenda, that certain groups of people are being used as guinea pigs, so to speak, to get the vaccines first. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's the real concern, particularly when you recognize that minority communities are vulnerable communities, but there's a long history of exploiting minorities, at least in the United States, for this kind of medical research. So it really is a sticky issue, and all I can do is say, look, the vaccines appear to be as safe as appear to be safe, and our assessment is a reasonable assessment based on all the data that we have, but somebody has to be first in line, right? And so we actually are asking, medical workers who are on the front lines already, who are risking their lives, to go one step further and to be, in effect, the very first people to receive the vaccines. So we're asking a lot of them in that sense. But again, everything that I see is that the vaccine is safe. I wouldn't have hesitancy to be vaccinated tomorrow if the opportunity presented itself.
Okay, and Dr. Rana, how forthcoming and how transparent are these companies being, like Pfizer, in terms of what is actually going in the vaccine, the ingredients and whatnot? I've heard other doctors say that they're cloaking them, but is there any truth to that?
Well, I mean, they have produced ingredient lists, and as I've gone through the ingredient list, it makes sense with respect to everything that we've seen. So everything in the ingredient list has been disclosed, and the chemical formulas are well known, and their biological effects are well known. Most of the ingredients are things that occur naturally in our bodies. The buffers that are used are naturally occurring. There's cholesterol, there are phospholipids that are naturally occurring membrane components, sucrose, which is a cryoprotectant. RNA is part of our bodies, and the RNA has been modified, and the modifications are proprietary, but it's designed to improve the stability and reduce the immunogenicity of the RNA. So there are some lipid components that are non-natural, but these have been studied in terms of their effects on human beings. So the companies, in my view, have been forthright. And when I look at the ingredient lists, everything makes perfect sense that I see there in terms of how they're contributing to the effectiveness of the vaccines.
Yeah, that's great to know. Now, Dr. Rana, you are in the interesting position of being not only a bioscientist, but also you work with a ministry, right? Reasons to Believe. So, with that in mind, is there any thoughts on if there's a divine purpose or how God might be involved in some way with the COVID situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, we could spend a long time unpacking that question,
Right.
but to me, I see God's providential care for humanity in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. In part, we have these incredible immune systems that are so sophisticated and elegant that really afford us as human beings protection from a wide range of different types of pathogens. And so that's the first place I see God's providence. But I also see science as a gift to humanity from God. And it's because of science that we've had, I think, largely effective public health policies that have slowed the spread of this virus. And it's through science that we've developed these vaccines. And to me, it's almost eerie when you think about the fact that these RNA vaccines, which are so amenable to very rapid production and large scale production of vaccines, were actually at the point of being, again, used in human clinical trials when COVID-19 hit, which meant that literally within days, the Pfizer and Moderna scientists had workable candidates once the gene sequence for the spike protein was available. And we're already progressing them into animal studies and into small scale human clinical studies within days. That coincidence and timing to me screams of God's providential care for humanity, that we were already positioned to deal with this pandemic because of God's providence.
Isn't that interesting? Well, it looks like we are out of time, but thanks so much for your time today, Dr. Rana.
My pleasure.